The tequila was a mistake. Jade knew it the second the harsh, earthy liquid burned a trail down her throat, but she signaled the bartender for another anyway. It was 2:13 a.m. on a Tuesday, which was technically a Wednesday, and the bar was a dimly lit pocket of regret tucked into the city's sprawling sleeplessness. The worn leather of the bar stool was cool against her legs, a small comfort after 12 hours on her feet. Her light blue scrubs, usually a symbol of competence and care, felt like a uniform of failure. The sharp, antiseptic scent of the hospital still clung to them, a ghost of the dressing down her supervisor had given her in front of the entire nursing station. You need to be faster, Jade. More efficient. This isn't a place for second-guessing. The words echoed in her head, louder than the low thrum of music in the bar. She had been second-guessing because the patient's chart had a discrepancy, a small detail that could have led to a massive medication error. She had been right to pause, to double-check, but in the frantic, overloaded world of the surgical ward, caution was often mistaken for incompetence. She took a long swallow of the second tequila, closing her eyes against the sting. She was a good nurse. She knew she was. But knowing it and feeling it were two different cities, separated by an ocean of exhaustion and self-doubt. When she opened her eyes, she caught a reflection in the mirror behind the bar. A man, sitting alone in a booth in the farthest, darkest corner of the room. He wasn't looking at her, not directly, but his stillness was a magnet. In a room of restless ghosts trying to drink away the night, he was an island of absolute calm. He wore a suit that was impossibly black, tailored so perfectly it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. It was the kind of suit that cost more than her car, probably more than a year of her salary. His hair was just as black, cut with a razor's precision. She couldn't see his face clearly, just the sharp angle of his jaw and the severe line of his shoulders. He held a glass of what looked like whiskey, the amber liquid untouched. He wasn't drinking. He was waiting. The air around him felt different, heavier, like the pressure before a storm. Jade told herself to look away. Men like that, men who radiated that kind of predatory patience, were not part of her world. Her world was beeping machines, sterile gauze, and the endless, thankless cycle of keeping people alive. She was about to turn back to her drink when two other men slid into his booth. They were big, thick-necked, and moved with a clumsy deference that was at odds with their size. They leaned in close to the man in the suit, their voices a low, urgent murmur. Jade couldn't hear the words, and she didn't want to. She finished her tequila, the glass making a sharp click as she set it down. Time to go. Time to go home to her empty apartment, sleep for 5 hours, and do it all over again. She paid her tab, sliding off the stool and pulling her worn messenger bag over her shoulder. The path to the exit took her past the corner booth. She kept her eyes forward, focused on the red neon exit sign that promised escape. But as she passed, a single phrase, spoken in a voice as cold and clear as ice, cut through the bar's low hum. The shipment is at Pier 7. Make sure Mr. Tanaka understands his retirement is permanent. The words snagged in her brain. She faltered for a half step, a barely perceptible hesitation. But it was enough. The silence that fell over the booth was instantaneous and absolute. It was a physical thing, a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She didn't dare look back. She quickened her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was almost at the door, her hand reaching for the cool metal push-bar. A shadow fell over her. One of the thick-necked men from the booth was suddenly there, blocking her path. He was a wall of muscle and cheap cologne. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. It wasn't a question. "I don't think so," Jade said, her own voice steadier than she felt. "I'm just leaving. The boss wants a word." She risked a glance back at the booth. The man in the suit was looking at her now. His face was no longer in shadow, and the sight of it stole the air from her lungs. He was handsome in a severe, sculpted way, his features sharp and unforgiving. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark, depthless, and utterly devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a man who had seen everything and felt nothing. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a command, a verdict. That was the moment everything changed. The world of beeping machines and sterile gauze dissolved, replaced by the silent, lethal certainty in a stranger's eyes. She knew, with a chilling clarity that had nothing to do with the tequila, that she was not going home tonight. She was led back to the booth, the big man's hand a heavy, proprietary weight on her arm. He didn't push her, but he didn't need to. The threat was in his presence, in the finality of the boss's gaze. She stood before the table, her bag clutched in front of her like a flimsy shield. The other man from the booth stood behind her, boxing her in. The bar, with its handful of lonely patrons, seemed to fade into the background, the entire universe shrinking to the polished surface of this small table and the man sitting behind it. He gestured to the seat opposite him. It was a silent order. Jade sat, her movements stiff. She placed her hands on the table, then decided that looked too bold, and put them in her lap. She felt like a specimen under a microscope. He watched her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thin and sharp. He hadn't said a word to her yet, but he was interrogating her with his stillness. He was cataloging her, the tired lines around her eyes, the faded hospital logo on her scrubs, the faint tremor in her hands. "What is her name?" he finally asked. His voice was low, controlled, with no discernible accent, but it held a resonance that vibrated through the wood of the table.
"Jade," she said.
Her voice was a little shaky. She cleared her throat. "Jade Thompson." "Jade Thompson," he repeated, the name sounding foreign and fragile on his tongue. "You are a nurse," it wasn't a question. He had already assessed her uniform. "Yes. You work long hours," again a statement of fact. He was peeling back her layers with casual precision. "It was a long shift," she admitted, not sure why she was answering. He leaned forward slightly, and the faint scent of cedarwood and something cold, like winter air, drifted across the table. "And at the end of this long shift, you heard something you were not meant to hear." Her blood ran cold. This was it, the point of no return. Her mind raced, searching for a lie, for any plausible deniability that might save her. But looking into his unblinking eyes, she knew a lie would be pointless. He would see it before the words even left her mouth. Honesty felt just as dangerous. "I don't know what you're talking about." She tried anyway, the words tasting like ash. A flicker of something, not amusement, but a kind of cold acknowledgement, passed through his eyes. He knew she was lying. He didn't even have the decency to call her on it. He simply let the lie hang in the air between them, suffocating her. He picked up his untouched glass of whiskey, swirling the amber liquid. The ice cubes clinked softly, the only sound in their small, charged world. "My name is Kwon Jae-hwan," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "And I have a problem. You, Nurse Thompson, have just become my problem." He set the glass down with a soft, definitive click. It was the sound of a cage door swinging shut. He wasn't angry. He wasn't threatening. He was stating an immutable fact, as if explaining a law of physics. Gravity holds you to the earth. The sun rises in the east. And you, Jade Thompson, now belong to me. His men flanked her as he stood. He moved with an unnerving grace, his bespoke suit not even wrinkling. He was taller than she had realized, casting a long shadow that swallowed her whole. "You will come with us," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a pronouncement. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through her exhaustion.
"No.
You can't just." "I can," he interrupted, his voice cutting through her protest with surgical finality. "And I will." He walked toward the exit, not looking back, absolutely certain that she would be brought along behind him. He moved like the world owed him a path. One of his men took her arm again, his grip firm and inescapable. She was walked out of the bar, past the oblivious bartender, and the remaining drinkers lost in their own misery. The cool night air hit her face, but it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like the first breath in a new prison. A black sedan, so sleek and polished it seemed to absorb the city lights, was waiting at the curb. The back door was open for her. Jae-hwan was already inside, a silhouette against the far window, waiting. This was not a negotiation. This was a transaction, and her life was the currency. She got into the car. The penthouse was a cage of glass and steel, perched high above the glittering sprawl of the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed a panorama of lights that stretched to the horizon, a beautiful, mocking testament to a world she could see but no longer touch. The interior was brutally minimalist: black leather, polished chrome, and stark white walls adorned with a single, massive abstract painting in shades of crimson and black. It looked like a beautiful wound. Jade had been there for 3 days. She was not locked in a room. She was given the run of the main living area, a sprawling space that included a kitchen stocked with food she had no appetite for. She was a ghost in someone else's perfect, sterile life. Jae-hwan was rarely there. He would appear in the morning, dressed in another immaculate suit, and leave without a word. He would return late at night, his presence announced by the soft chime of the private elevator, and disappear into his own wing of the penthouse. They existed in the same space, but on different planes of reality. Her guard was a silent man named Min, one of the two from the bar. He sat in a chair by the elevator, never speaking, his eyes following her every move. She had tried talking to him on the first day. "Where am I? What does he want?" He had simply looked through her, his expression as blank and unyielding as the concrete walls. On the 4th day, the silence broke. Jae-hwan did not leave in the morning. He was in the main living area when she emerged from the guest suite she'd been given, standing before the vast windows with his back to her. He was on the phone, his voice a low, clipped rhythm of Korean. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was cold, lethal fury, tightly controlled but simmering just beneath the surface. He ended the call with a sharp, final word and stood in complete stillness for a long moment, his shoulders rigid. She should have retreated. She should have slipped back into her room and waited for the storm to pass. But something in his posture, a tension so profound it seemed to pull all the air from the room, held her in place. He finally turned, and his eyes, usually so controlled, were blazing. He saw her standing there, and for a second, he looked at her not as a problem or a prisoner, but as an unwelcome witness to a crack in his armor. "Get out," he snapped, his voice rough. But she didn't move. Her nursing instincts, the same ones that had gotten her reprimanded, kicked in. She saw past the anger to the source. It was pain, deep, old, and festering. "What's wrong?" The question was out before she could stop it. He stared at her, his jaw tight. "That is not your concern. You're bleeding," she said quietly. He glanced down at his left hand. A thin line of red trickled from his clenched fist. He had been gripping his phone so tightly that the corner had sliced into his palm. He seemed not to have even noticed. He looked at the blood with a detached sort of surprise, then back at her, his expression hardening. "It is nothing," he said, turning away to a wet bar in the corner. He grabbed a napkin and pressed it against the cut, a clumsy, inadequate gesture. Jade walked toward him. Every instinct screamed at her to keep her distance, but a stronger, more ingrained impulse pushed her forward. "Let me see," she said, her voice gentle but firm, the voice she used with scared patience. "I don't need a nurse. You have one anyway," she countered, stopping just in front of him. "That will need stitches." He looked down at her, a complicated, dangerous expression on his face. It was a war between his instinct to control everything and the raw, unguarded moment he found himself in. For a heartbeat, she thought he would shove her away. Instead, he slowly, reluctantly, uncurled his fingers. The cut was deeper than she thought, a clean, surgical gash in the fleshy part of his palm. "There's a first aid kit in the bathroom of my suite," he said, his voice low and grudging. It was a concession, a crack in the wall of ice. She went, her heart pounding a strange, unsteady rhythm. His suite was as Spartan and controlled as the rest of the penthouse, but more personal. A book on military strategy lay open on the nightstand. The scent of cedar was stronger here. She found the kit, a professional-grade setup that was far more extensive than a typical household box. She brought it back to the living area. He was still standing by the window, staring out at the city, the bloody napkin still pressed to his hand. She set the kit on the granite countertop. "Sit down," she instructed, her professional demeanor taking over. He hesitated, then sat on one of the bar stools. She worked in silence, her movements efficient and sure. She cleaned the wound, her touch gentle but firm. He watched her, his gaze intense, tracking the movement of her fingers. He didn't flinch when she applied the antiseptic. He didn't make a sound. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't empty or hostile. It was filled with a strange, humming tension. She was touching him, a person who, 3 days ago, had stolen her life with a single nod. And he was letting her. "The man you mentioned," she said, her voice just above a whisper as she prepared a butterfly bandage. "Tanaka. Is he why you're so angry?" Jae-hwan's hand tensed under hers. He was a traitor. He sold information to a rival. Information that cost me someone I was sworn to protect. The words hung in the air. This wasn't just business. This was personal. This was the source of the pain she had seen in his eyes. "Who?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked away from her, out the window at the indifferent city. "My mentor's wife."
She was.
Collateral damage. Years ago. Tanaka was the one who gave them her location. His emotional wound, the one vulnerability he carried, was suddenly laid bare on the sterile surface of his designer kitchen. He had failed to protect someone. A woman. And the man responsible was still a threat. She finished closing the wound, her fingers brushing against his. A current, small but unmistakable, passed between them. He looked from her hands to her face, his dark eyes searching hers. It was the first time he had looked at her like a person, and not just a piece on his chessboard. That was when the elevator chimed. Not the soft, private chime of his arrival, but a loud, insistent alarm. Red lights flashed on a security panel by the door. Min, the guard, jumped to his feet, pulling a weapon from his jacket. "They're here," Jae-hwan said, his voice devoid of all emotion except a lethal calm. He stood up, his injured hand forgotten, and his body shifted into a tense, predatory posture. He looked at Jade, and his eyes were cold again but with a different kind of coldness. It was the chill of imminent violence. "Stay behind me." The sound of automatic gunfire erupted from the hallway outside, shredding the elevator doors. The glass of the penthouse windows, thick and reinforced, spiderwebbed as bullets hammered against it from the outside. They were being attacked from 2 sides. The cage had become a kill box. In the chaos, as Jae-hwan and Min moved to intercept the intruders pouring from the ruined elevator, Jade saw her chance. A service staircase, hidden behind a panel in the kitchen. A way out. She could run. She could disappear into the firefight and escape. It was what any sane person would do. But as she took a step toward it, she saw one of the attackers break away, flanking Jae-hwan, his weapon raised. Jae-hwan was occupied with 2 others, his movements a brutal, efficient dance of death. He wouldn't see the new threat in time. Jade didn't think.
She acted.
She grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a ridiculously expensive crystal decanter from the bar, and hurled it with all her strength at a shelving unit loaded with glasses near the attacker. The crash was explosive. A shower of shattering glass rained down, causing the gunman to flinch and turn toward the sound for a fatal half-second. It was all the time Jae-hwan needed. He moved with impossible speed, a blur of black cloth and deadly intent. The threat was neutralized. The firefight was over almost as quickly as it began. The penthouse was a wreck of shattered glass, splintered wood, and bleeding bodies. In the ringing silence that followed, Jae-hwan turned to look at her. He walked across the room, stepping over a fallen enemy without a glance, his eyes locked on hers. He stopped in front of her, his chest rising and falling with the aftermath of adrenaline. He was so close, she could feel the heat radiating from him. He reached out, not his injured hand, but the other, and his fingers brushed a piece of glass from her hair. His touch was surprisingly gentle. You could have run, he said, his voice a low rasp. You would have been shot, she replied, her own voice breathless. He stared at her, and the distance between them collapsed. It was more than proximity. It was a connection forged in violence and adrenaline. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. He was the most dangerous man she had ever met. He was her captor. And in that moment, she understood with terrifying clarity that she had just chosen to stay. She had saved his life, and in doing so, had bound herself to him in a way that was far more permanent than any locked door. The aftermath was a study in cold efficiency. Within minutes, a team of men in dark suits arrived, their movements silent and practiced. They cleared the bodies, cleaned the blood from the Italian marble, and boarded up the shattered windows, plunging the penthouse into an artificial twilight. It was as if the brutal violence had been a dream, erased by a quiet, disciplined crew that specialized in making problems disappear. Jade watched them work, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. This was his world. A world where death was a logistical issue, not a tragedy. Jae-hwan stood apart from it all, issuing quiet orders into his phone. He never raised his voice, but his authority was absolute. Men twice his size listened and obeyed without question. When he was done, he walked over to where she was sitting on an undamaged sofa, her arms wrapped around herself. He sat not beside her, but on the glass coffee table in front of her, leaning forward so their knees were almost touching. They know about you, he said, his voice flat. The men who attacked us. They belong to the Ito clan, Tanaka's new partners. They didn't just come for me. They came for you. Why? The word was a whisper.
I'm nobody.
To them, you are not nobody, he corrected her, his dark eyes intense. You are a witness. A loose end. But now you are something else. You are a liability they believe I value. The implication hung in the air between them. They thought she was his weakness. The idea was absurd. She was his prisoner. But his rivals didn't know that. They saw a woman in his penthouse, a woman he kept close, and they made an assumption that had just put a target on her back. I need to leave, she said, more to herself than to him. If I'm gone, I'm not a target anymore. Do you really believe they would let you go? He asked, a touch of something that might have been bitter irony in his voice. You walk out that door. You are dead before you reach the street. They will not stop hunting you. With me, you have a chance. Without me, you have none. He was right. She knew he was right. She had seen their faces, the cold determination in their eyes. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back to her old life of beeping machines and charting patient vitals. That life was gone, shattered like the crystal decanter she had thrown. What you did, he said, his voice softer now, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. With the decanter. It was intelligent. It was the closest thing to a compliment he had ever given her. It felt strange, like a flicker of warmth in a frozen landscape.
It was instinct, she said.
Your instincts are good, he stated. You see things. You saw I was injured when I did not. You saw the thread I missed, he paused, his gaze unwavering. That makes you dangerous. And valuable. The next few days were a blur of movement. The penthouse was no longer secure. They moved to a new location, a nondescript townhouse in a quiet, wealthy suburb, its exterior hiding a fortress of technology and security. The forced proximity intensified. There were no separate wings here. They shared the same space, ate at the same table, breathed the same air. The tension between them was a constant, living thing, a hum of awareness beneath every silent meal, every accidental brush of hands as they passed in a hallway. She saw the toll the escalating war was taking on him. He slept less, ate little. He spent hours in his study, a room filled with monitors displaying security feeds and encrypted communications. One evening, she brought him a cup of tea. He was staring at a photograph on his desk, his expression unguarded, filled with a profound and aching loss. It was a picture of him with an older man and a smiling woman. My mentor, he said, his voice quiet, noticing her gaze. And his wife, Sora. The woman Tanaka betrayed. He didn't have to say anything more. She saw it in the lines of grief etched onto his face. This wasn't just about territory or business. This was a vendetta. A debt of blood he felt he had to pay. The enemy made their next move a week later. It wasn't a frontal assault. It was something more insidious, more personal. A package arrived, delivered through a compromised channel. Inside was a single item, a nurse's name badge. The photo was of her, taken from her hospital personnel file. The name, however, was not Jade Thompson. It was a different name, one she hadn't used in years. A name connected to a past she had worked hard to bury. Jaehwan brought it to her, his face a grim mask. Explain this. Her blood turned to ice. She had run from that life, changed her name, and started over. She had told herself it was behind her. But the underworld had long arms, and a person's history was just another weapon to be used. It's from a long time ago, she said, her voice trembling. I was involved with someone. He was not a good person. I was a witness to something, and I testified against him.
I was put into a protection program.
I built the new life. Jaehwan stared at the name badge, then at her. The pieces were clicking into place for him. Her competence under pressure. Her survival instincts. She wasn't just an ordinary nurse who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had a history with a world that ran parallel to his. This man you testified against, he said slowly, his voice dangerously soft. Was his name Marco Valenti? Jade flinched. Valenti was a mid-level player in the Italian syndicate, a rival to Jaehwan's own organization. The Ito clan hadn't just found her. They had found the perfect weapon to use against him. They had allied themselves with his rival, using Jade's past to create a two-front war. They're not just targeting me to get to you, she realized, the horror dawning on her. They're using my past to bring your old enemies into this fight. She had tried to be an asset, but she had just become his single greatest liability. The weight of it was crushing. She looked at him, expecting to see anger, accusation. Instead, she saw a flicker of something else. A shared understanding. They were both haunted by their pasts, both trapped in a cycle of violence. That night, she couldn't sleep. She found him on the small, enclosed balcony, staring out into the dark. The city lights were a distant glow. I'm sorry, she whispered, standing beside him. I've made things worse for you. He turned to her, the faint light catching the sharp planes of his face. You did not ask for this. You, like Sora, were pulled into a world that should have never touched you. I'm not like her, Jade said, her voice fierce with a certainty that surprised her. I'm not collateral damage. I'm not a victim. She took a step closer, her resolve hardening. She had spent years running from her past, hiding from the person she used to be. But here, in the heart of the storm, she realized running was no longer an option. The only way out was through. I know Valenti, she said, her voice low and steady. I know how he thinks. I know his weaknesses. Let me help you. Not as a prisoner. Not as a liability. Let me help you end this. He searched her face, his gaze stripping away all her defenses, looking for the truth of her words. The space between them crackled with an intensity that had nothing to do with the war outside and everything to do with the one raging within them. I told myself staying here was about survival, she confessed, the words raw and honest. I was lying to myself. He didn't ask what the truth was. He didn't have to. He reached out and cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. The gesture was possessive, tender, and terrifying all at once. You are a complication I did not plan for, Jade Thompson, he murmured, his voice a gravelly caress. He said her name differently than anyone else ever had. It was not just a name. It was a claim. And as he leaned in, closing the final inch between them, she did not pull away. She met him halfway, choosing this dangerous, uncertain world over the safe, empty one she had lost. The choice was made. The line was crossed. There was no going back.